Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a laser-focused, quick-fire interview on food and the economy with international experts where we seek answers to questions all of us should be asking. I'm Ajay Jakhar, Chairman, Bharat Krishik Samaj of Farmers Forum India. Today, we are excited for joining us is Professor Hannah Wittman at the Faculty of Food and Food Systems and Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability, the University of British Columbia. Thank you, Professor Wittman, for joining us today.
Thank you, AJ, for having me.
It's been an interesting week. The UN Food Systems Summit has drawn to a close with kind of feeling where we get is we have miles to go before we sleep. But on that point, I will come back to later. Our first question is, you represent transformational thinking around environmental agrarian citizenship. How did this thinking evolve over the years?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a very long story, but the short version is that I grew up on a farm in the northwest of the United States, and we grew a lot of our own food, and taking care of the land was always a big part of our family teachings. When I moved to the city and I started learning more about the global food system and where the food that I found in the grocery stores actually came from, and I began to understand the profit-oriented drivers that led to treating the earth and farm workers so badly, I was outraged, and this was so different than my childhood experience. But I found that it was actually becoming more and more the norm in how food was produced and distributed in the global food system. So the concept of agrarian citizenship emerged once I started working with the landless rural workers movement in Brazil, and they're a food sovereignty oriented social movement that tries to occupy land and exercise their rights to land as part of their citizenship rights in Brazil. And so I studied with the MST during my PhD fieldwork, and one of their slogans was, "We cultivate the earth and the earth cultivates us." And this implied a two-way relationship between people and nature and between rights and responsibilities. And that really was the basis of when I started thinking and writing more critically about the theory of agrarian citizenship.
Years back, you wrote on the framework of food sovereignty, broadly defined it as the right of local people to control their own food systems, including markets, ecological resources, food cultures, and production modes. 10 years later, the world has drifted further away from those causes. What hampers their development and what is the way forward?
Yeah, a root cause of this process, or this current conjuncture, as we could call it, in the words of Phil McMichael, is what we call the metabolic rift. And this concept describes the distance that has grown between eaters and we call them growers, or people who cultivate food, whether that be indigenous peoples with wild harvest, or farmers in the global south for subsistence, or even commercial or capitalist farmers in developed countries who are growing food for the global market. And in each of these cases, farmers often can no longer make a living due to policies and structural constraints imposed by the concentration of the corporate food supply chain. This is supported by inappropriate subsidies and the reduction of agricultural support due to neoliberal agricultural policies. And on that note, the FAO has just produced a great report calling for the reframing and just a total revision of what we call agricultural support and subsidies. It's a great read. These problems of moving away from food sovereignty rather than towards it are exacerbated by rural violence, by gender inequity, and by climate change. And so all of these kind of connected problems have resulted in many people, including myself, leaving farming as a career and moving to the city. Fewer people farming means more and more of us lose that connection to our local community and our local food production systems. And urban people then lose their connection, or what we call food literacy, with the ways that food is grown and who controls it. So to repair this rift, so many farm and agricultural social movements now are refocusing their efforts on supporting youth to return to the land and to rebuild those relationships from the ground up. So I think a focus on youth as a way to repair is currently a really important topic.
I'll come to the question of where you're talking about, consolidation in food value chains. This is something like what you seem to be referring at. I work with a farmers organization which believes that it's a clear and present danger to producers, to the food and the planet. The UN Food Systems Summit does not seem to have addressed it adequately, or if at all. And why do you think that would have happened?
That's a great question. And it's not just the Food Systems Summit. This is an issue that is pervasive in government policies and global development agency policies since the last 40 years. And I think it has to do with, among other things, a cultural narrative that's still based on really outdated notions of economic development, based on privatization and consolidation as the most efficient way to do business and to feed people. I used to teach a text by Thomas Princeton at the University of Michigan, and it's called The Logic of Sufficiency, which very capably debunks the myth of efficiency as proposed by many of the kind of corporate and public partnerships that are driving the consolidation of the food system. And this alternative logic, this logic of sufficiency, which shares many of the values and principles of the food sovereignty movement, calls for a totally different logic that takes into account public, social, and environmental goods, as well as purely economic ones.
Keeping to this point, you have been outspoken about powerful companies and industry associations within agriculture sector which funnel funds towards industrially grown commodity crops these corporations rely on for profits. How has that impacted agriculture research in regenerative systems in the United States and farming in the United States?
Yeah, and this has to do not just with the United States. I mean, this phenomena, what Sheila Slaughter calls academic capitalism, which really involves the privatization of agricultural research, particularly in the areas of plant breeding and biotechnology. And it's reshaped the funding model in higher education in the late 20th and early 21st centuries in really pervasive ways. So the idea was that the public should only invest in areas with a clear economic return. So coming back to that idea of efficiency, and then investment and resulting economic benefit should be matched by and directed to industry. And since agroecology, regenerative agriculture, organic, and other forms of sustainable agriculture by definition aim to reduce our reliance on external chemical inputs, this industrial match funding model left this sector kind of struggling for resources. So investment in research was completely wiped out in this more public good oriented kind of agriculture. And to illustrate this, colleagues at the University of California found that only between 4 and 15% of total funding for competitive research grants at the US Department of Agriculture went to projects involving agroecology, despite the clear public and environmental benefits of those practices.
I think if you look at the budgets of other agriculture research institutions, it's even less than what you're talking about, and that's awful. But which gets us to the question of transgenic food production. How does it fit into the overall thinking of food security at global and regional levels? Is there any analysis of the correlation between GMOs, biodiversity induced losses? Will alternative or lab-grown meat, for instance, address the needs of animal proteins in human diets? What are your views on these techno fixes?
Those are great questions, and they're questions that are, on the headlines of our news magazines, and consumers are really interested. But you really have to dig deep into what is the framework that these techno fixes are based on, and that has to be looked at as part of a package of inputs, not just simply a new technology, but all the associated structural, institutional, and kind of political, economic, chemical inputs that go to make these new technologies work. And so far, the most economically dominant and widely used transgenic crops are those that are designed to require a package of expensive synthetic inputs. So these crops, we're talking about the Roundup Ready corn, just as one example, these work best in large-scale monocultures. And global governments have failed to enforce even the minimum of standards for soil health, forest conservation, and water quality in spaces where these monoculture production systems dominate. And so that has had this add-on effect, this add-on devastating effect on global biodiversity. So it's not just the technology of genetic modification that is the issue, it's the package of products, inputs, and processes around that to benefit particular kinds of agriculture for particular kinds of corporate agriculture that have led to these devastating effects on biodiversity. So on lab-grown meat, which is a totally different technology, super interesting, and one of my PhD students has just gone on to do a postdoc on this topic, so I'm very excited to find out what he learns in this new opportunity. Given that industrial meat production is one of the most egregious contributors to global climate change, to human rights violations for food processing workers, to human health, alternatives such as plant-based meats and cellular lab-based meat, which is actually a different technology altogether, I'm really interested to see where this comes. The problem again is who is benefiting from the structure set up to make these industries succeed. So what kind of organizations are receiving government grants and subsidies? What is the regulatory and incentive structure for cellular agriculture, and who's controlling that? So, many of the same questions emerge about who gets to say, where is the analysis about long-term implications of these technologies, and where are the safeguards? So where are the checks and balances that would ensure that these kinds of technological innovations can have a socially beneficial impact rather than just a profit-oriented one?
When you talk about controls, safeguards, regulation, what comes to mind is the UN Food Systems Summit. It was supposed to address such issues. It has addressed some of them. What has been your opinion about what it's achieved or its missed opportunities, specifically to the issue of food sovereignty and other such issues? What are your misgivings, or what is your view on it?
Yeah, the UN Food Systems Summit, again, as we were talking, it could have been a really good opportunity to bring diverse global actors together who really care about food systems, who care about sustainability, who care about improving equity, who care about nutrition and women's rights in agriculture and all these things. Unfortunately, the UN Food Systems Summit wasn't designed to have those conversations. It was organized by the World Economic Forum. It was led by the president of the much critiqued Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. So from the very beginning, it had there was a very prominent concern about the corporate capture of that conversation. It then subsequently went on to place corporate interests at the forefront and completely ignored systemic power imbalances in the way that food policy is developed and implemented. So the problem, as articulated in much more detail by civil society groups such as the Via Campesina and the Agroecology Research Collective, is that the Food Systems Summit is kind of making an end run around established mechanisms of civil society and government consultation that have been carefully constructed over the last 20 years, mainly convened by the United Nations Committee on World Food Security and the FAO. So as a result of this kind of procedural problem, and when we talk about making change in the world, it's all about procedure. We can't get to the end that we want without paying very careful attention to the process. And so as a result, some of the most prominent global food sovereignty activists and community-based organizations boycotted the summit. And as a result, the summit has not been able to have the necessary conversations about food sovereignty, and it was actually designed to not be able to do that.
And interestingly, some of these all the paperwork that's going to come out from the action tracks is anyway going to Rome-based agencies, to the very agencies you thought should have been doing it in the first place. It's ironic, but that's what's happening. Which gets me to it's a really interesting answer that you've given. But it gets me to the last question. the entire body of progress seems to be running into a wall of climate change that is breaking down resilience even as we are building on it. I know you're not a soothsayer, but what is our destiny from where you sit?
From where I sit, it's a hard question to answer for anybody. And I just visited my family who just went through a 100-year drought this season, and their farm is surviving because they were able to access federal crop insurance. And I think about the many global farmers who don't have that luxury. We have a lot of solutions in our toolbox. We know how to give better support to diversified and complex farming systems, including subsidies for publicly beneficial practices, including crop insurance for all crops, not just the primary commodities. And these tools, we know the process by which they can improve resiliency in food stocks and farmer livelihoods in the face of climate change. So, it's not that we don't know what the solutions are, it's having the political will to implement them, to have more targeted investment in food for people rather than for profit, having actual research and public extension support for agroecological transitions. And, if you just look at Brazil's Zero Hunger platform between 2003 and 2014, even a minimal amount of investment, we showed had very positive outcomes in small scale and diversified farming operations and food security and protection of the environment. So we have the tools, it just requires political will. And what we're really pushing is that in order to get these policies implemented and enacted, this is not a rural people's problem. This is a problem of anybody in the world who eats food. And so urban people really need to get involved in these food sovereignty struggles. Urban people care about biodiversity, they care about climate change, and getting involved in food system advocacy is a really good way to realize the kind of changes that will have the biggest impacts on those big problems. So, we always talk about the fight happens in the grocery store as well as in the field. And I think it's a good opportunity to keep having those conversations between rural and urban people.
You're so right. Not only do we need conversations, we need more activism on the street to get policymakers to act on even the commitments they make.
Exactly. It's not that we don't know what the solutions are. We just need to do it.
We need to do it. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for taking time out to join us today. And it's been a pleasure to follow your work. And it's good to have met you and known you through this UN food system process. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, AJ. It was a really enjoyable conversation. Have a great day.